Mia's life turns into a silent struggle when her stepmother, Rachel, begins treating her like an outsider in her own home. Forced into servitude while her stepsisters live in luxury, Mia suffers in silence until her father finally uncovers the heartbreaking truth. But as the family confronts Rachel's hidden prejudice, the question remains, will they survive the storm that's about to break, or will Mia lose the only family she has left? Before we get started, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe for more exciting content, and let us know where you're watching from in the comments. Now, let's dive in. Mia sat at the edge of her bed, her small hands gripping the worn edges of the blanket that used to belong to her mother. The room, dimly lit by a flickering bedside lamp, felt colder than usual tonight. She glanced at the framed picture of her and her father on the nightstand, taken just a year ago when life was simpler. Before everything changed, her father Marcus was everything to her. A warm smile, gentle eyes, and arms that wrapped around her in love. He had always been her protector, her rock. But things had shifted in their home, and the warmth she once felt was slowly being drained away by the presence of Rachel, her new stepmother. Rachel was polite enough when her father was around, but when they were alone, her demeanor changed like the flip of a coin. Mia's heart ached with confusion. She couldn't understand why Rachel treated her differently. Why did she make her feel like she didn't belong in her own home? Rachel's daughters, Amber and Lily, were always given the best, the finest clothes, the latest toys, and most importantly, their mother's affection. Mia, however, was given a list of tasks. It started small. Mia, could you help clean up the dishes? Or, Mia, could you sweep the living room? But as the weeks passed, these small requests turned into full-fledged responsibilities. The chores piled up, and with each passing day, Mia felt more like a guest in her own life. Marcus was busy. His job as a consultant for a growing company kept him away from home more often than not. He'd always been the type to work hard for his family, but that dedication now seemed to separate him from seeing what was happening under his own roof. Mia never complained. She couldn't bring herself to tell him about the growing distance between her and Rachel. She knew how much he wanted to make this new family work, how desperately he wanted to give her a motherly figure after the loss of her mom. She didn't want to be the reason things fell apart. But Mia felt the change. She felt it when Rachel would look at her with thinly veiled disdain, barely concealing her coldness. It was in the way she spoke to her, never using her name, always ordering her around as though Mia were a burden. Mia noticed the difference in how her stepsisters were treated. Amber and Lily were doted on, praised, and loved openly. They didn't have to lift a finger to help around the house. And then there was Mia, who, by Rachel's standards, couldn't seem to do anything right. One evening, after Mia had finished mopping the kitchen floor, one of the many chores she had been assigned, she overheard Rachel talking to a neighbor on the phone. "Oh, Mia? Yes, she's different, isn't she? Her father tries, but you know how it is. She's just not like my girls." The words stung, cutting deeper than Mia had expected. Different. What did that even mean? She knew what Rachel was implying. It wasn't just about Mia being Marcus's child from his first marriage. It was about who Mia was. The color of her skin, her hair, the way she carried herself, and perhaps most importantly, what she wasn't. Mia wasn't Rachel's, and Rachel made sure to remind her of that every day. Her stepsisters, while not cruel, followed their mother's example. They were indifferent to Mia, treating her more like a housemaid than a sibling. When they spilled juice or dropped their toys on the floor, Mia was called to clean it up. When they laughed together, Mia was left in the silence of her duties. She felt like a shadow, always present, but never truly seen. One night, after Mia had completed her long list of chores, she sat alone at the dinner table, finishing the scraps of food left from Amber and Lily's meal. Rachel had given her a tired look, dismissing her from their family dinner. "Go to your room, Mia. You've done enough." Mia obeyed, like she always did. As she climbed the stairs to her room, her heart heavy with loneliness, she overheard a conversation between Rachel and her father. They were discussing summer plans for the family, a vacation to the mountains, a place where Rachel's family had a cabin. Mia's ears perked up. She hadn't been on a vacation since her mother passed away, and the idea of spending time with her father excited her. "We'll need to figure out something for Mia," Rachel said, her voice laced with a forced kindness. "I don't think it would be appropriate for her to join us on this trip. It's just, my family is very particular." Mia froze. Rachel didn't even want her to come. Her heart sank as she realized that the family vacation she had longed for didn't include her. She was an outsider in her own home, unwanted and unneeded. That night, Mia curled up in her bed, hugging the blanket tightly around her small frame. The picture of her and her father sat on the nightstand, and she stared at it with tear-filled eyes. How had things gotten so bad? Why couldn't her father see what was happening? She wanted to tell him, to make him understand, but fear kept her silent. She didn't want to be the reason for more pain. She didn't want to lose him, too. In the quiet of the night, Mia whispered to herself, "I just want to be seen." The days in Mia's life blended into one another like watercolor washes on an endless canvas, soft, muted, and indistinct. It seemed as though every time she woke up, she was preparing herself for another day of silent endurance. What was once a home full of laughter, at least when her father was around, had become a place where she felt like an unwanted visitor. The weight of Rachel's disapproval pressed down on her, and there was no relief in sight. Each morning began the same way. Mia woke before anyone else, creeping quietly downstairs to prepare breakfast for the household. Rachel had made it clear that the kitchen was Mia's responsibility. Amber and Lily would tumble down the stairs, cheerful and carefree, expecting their meals to be ready. Their lives continued unburdened, and though they were not overtly unkind to Mia, they never questioned why she was doing all the work. It simply became the way things were. Mia, the maid. Amber and Lily, the princesses. Mia would wipe down counters, wash dishes, and sweep floors before rushing to school, her body already tired from the morning's work. By the time she sat at her desk, her classmates were chattering about their weekends, their families, and their vacations. Mia felt the distance growing between her and her peers. She had little to contribute to the conversation anymore. Her weekends were consumed with chores, and her evenings with Rachel's cold commands. She sat quietly at her desk, her schoolwork slipping as the exhaustion crept into her mind. The teachers noticed Mia's decline, but attributed it to shyness or perhaps some struggles at home. None of them dug deep enough to see the truth of what was happening behind Mia's quiet eyes. And Mia, not wanting to stir trouble, said nothing. She had learned that speaking up often led to more trouble than it was worth. When she had once told Rachel that she was feeling overwhelmed with the chores and schoolwork, Rachel had responded with a thin smile and said, "Well, if you're struggling, maybe you're just not working hard enough. I suppose there's more we need to work on with you." That work meant even more tasks. Mia's afternoons were filled with scrubbing floors, doing laundry, and running errands for Rachel. She would often find herself in the grocery store, clutching a list written in Rachel's neat, cold handwriting, buying food and supplies for the house, while Amber and Lily lounged around with their friends. Mia's heart ached as she saw girls her age in the store, laughing and shopping with their mothers. She had once been that girl, holding her mother's hand, sharing small jokes and inside stories that no one else would understand. But that was gone now, as distant as a forgotten dream. The worst part was that Rachel's disdain wasn't always overt. It wasn't as if she shouted or raised her hand against Mia. It was more subtle than that, and in some ways, that made it even harder to bear. The slight roll of her eyes when Mia didn't complete a task to her exacting standards. The way she spoke to her in clipped tones, never quite raising her voice, but making sure Mia understood her disappointment. The casual dismissals at family gatherings, where Mia would sit on the edge of conversations, never truly invited to participate. The family dinners were the most difficult to endure. Every night, Mia would help set the table and serve the food. She would sit at the far end of the table, opposite Rachel, who would smile and engage in lively conversation with her daughters. Amber would tell stories about her latest achievements at school or the dance classes she had been taking. Lily would share her excitement about a new friend she made or a school project she was proud of. And Rachel would beam with pride, showering her daughters with praise. But when Mia spoke, the atmosphere shifted. Marcus, kind and loving as he was, would try to include her, asking about her day or how school was going. Mia would answer quietly, always feeling a sense of inadequacy under Rachel's gaze. Rachel would respond with a perfunctory nod, her eyes flicking away as though Mia's words held no weight. There was always a subtle but clear message: you do not belong here. Mia often wondered if her father noticed. He had to, didn't he? But he was so wrapped up in his work and the daily grind that he seemed blind to the growing chasm between his daughter and his wife. When he was home, he was loving, always making time for a quick hug or a brief chat before bed. But these moments were fleeting, and Mia couldn't find the courage to tell him the full story. How could she? He had worked so hard to rebuild a family after the loss of her mother, and she didn't want to destroy the fragile peace he had created. Still, the small moments of affection from her father weren't enough to fill the growing void in Mia's life. She missed her mother fiercely. Late at night, when the house was quiet and the only sounds were the rustling of the wind outside, Mia would lie in bed and think about her mother. She could barely remember her face now. It had been so long since she had seen her, but she remembered the way her mother made her feel. Loved, important, safe. All the things that were slowly slipping away from her now. Mia's schoolwork continued to decline, but no one seemed to notice. Rachel dismissed it as Mia's laziness or lack of focus. Her classmates, who once invited her to birthday parties and playdates, had started to pull away. Mia didn't have the energy to keep up with friendships, and soon the invitations stopped coming altogether. She was becoming invisible, both at home and at school, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. But the worst day came when Mia overheard Rachel talking to Marcus one evening. She had been finishing up the dishes when she heard her name mentioned from the living room. Quietly, she crept closer to the door, her heart racing as she strained to hear the conversation. "Marcus," Rachel said, her voice dripping with feigned concern. "I'm really worried about Mia. She's not doing well in school, and she seems distant. I think maybe she needs some tough love, you know? Some structure. She's been slacking off lately, and I don't think we should coddle her." Mia's heart dropped. She wanted to burst into the room and tell her father the truth, to tell him how Rachel had made her life a living nightmare. But she couldn't. The fear of causing more tension between her father and stepmother kept her frozen in place. Marcus sighed heavily, and for a moment Mia dared to hope that he would defend her. But instead, he said, "I'll talk to her. Maybe you're right. She has seemed a bit off lately." Mia's throat tightened. The one person who had always been her champion, her father, was slipping away, too. It felt like betrayal, though she knew he didn't mean it that way. He just didn't see the truth. From that moment on, Mia knew she was truly on her own. The house was quieter than usual that afternoon. Mia was in the kitchen, her hands deep in the soapy water, scrubbing dishes from lunch. The soft clinking of plates was the only sound breaking the stillness. But even the mundane task of washing dishes felt heavier than usual today. Mia's thoughts wandered as she worked, replaying the events of the last few weeks, her father's growing absence, Rachel's increasing demands, and the gnawing feeling of loneliness that now seemed to follow her everywhere. She had learned to endure the daily grind in silence. It had become a survival mechanism, avoiding confrontation, keeping her head down, and doing what was asked without complaint. But inside, Mia was starting to crack. She could feel it in the way her heart raced when Rachel called her name, in the tremble of her hands as she scrubbed the floor or ironed clothes. She knew she wasn't perfect. She made mistakes, like any child would, but with Rachel, those mistakes felt monumental. Today, as Mia cleaned the kitchen alone, Rachel's words from earlier replayed in her mind. She had reprimanded Mia for not folding Amber and Lily's laundry to her exact specifications. "You need to learn how to do things right, Mia," Rachel had said with a sharp tone, her arms crossed as she watched Mia struggle to refold a pile of clothes. "I'm not going to tolerate laziness in this house. We all have our responsibilities." Mia had bitten her lip, fighting back the tears that always seemed to well up at the worst moments. She didn't dare look Rachel in the eye, knowing that it would only invite more criticism. Instead, she had nodded quietly and redone the work, hoping that this time it would be good enough to avoid another lecture. The door creaked softly, and Mia's heart leapt in her chest. She turned to see her father, Marcus, standing in the doorway. He was home early, which was unusual, but before she could greet him, she noticed the look on his face, troubled, almost as if he wasn't quite sure what to say. He didn't smile like he usually did when he came home. Instead, he stood there for a moment, watching her. Mia felt her pulse quicken. "Hi, Dad," she said softly, setting the dish down and wiping her hands on a towel. She wasn't sure if he was upset or if something had happened at work. "Hey, Mia," Marcus replied, his voice quiet but warm. He crossed the room in a few strides, his eyes flicking to the pile of dishes in the sink and then to the spotless floor. "You're doing all this by yourself?" Mia nodded, forcing a small smile. "Yeah, just trying to finish up before I start my homework." Marcus frowned slightly, his brow furrowing as he looked around the kitchen. "Where's Rachel? And Amber and Lily?" "They're upstairs," Mia said, glancing toward the staircase. "Rachel asked me to take care of the kitchen and some of the laundry." There was a long pause as Marcus processed her words. He opened his mouth as if to say something, but then closed it again, his expression unreadable. Mia felt a knot form in her stomach. There was something in the air, an unspoken tension that made her feel uneasy. Without another word, Marcus turned and walked toward the living room. Mia watched him go, her heart sinking. She wanted to tell him everything, about how Rachel treated her, how she felt like a burden in her own home, but the words stuck in her throat. She didn't want to cause problems. She didn't want to be the reason her father was upset. And so, like always, she stayed silent. What Mia didn't know was that Marcus had been home for a while. He had arrived early, hoping to surprise his family with a rare free afternoon. But when he had quietly entered the house, he overheard Rachel in the hallway, speaking to Amber in a low voice. "I don't care what she says," Rachel had muttered, her voice sharp and filled with frustration. "Mia needs to learn her place. She's not like us, Amber. She never will be. Your father may not see it, but I do. Someone has to keep her in line." Marcus had stopped in his tracks, hidden from view, his heart pounding in his chest. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. He had always known that Rachel was strict with Mia, but this was something else. There was a venom in her words, an unmistakable bitterness that sent a chill through him. His mind raced, trying to make sense of it. How long had this been going on? How had he missed it? His heart broke as he stood there, listening to the woman he thought he knew reveal a side of herself that he hadn't seen before. He felt like a fool. How could he have been so blind? He thought about all the times Mia had seemed distant, tired, or withdrawn. All the times she had said, "I'm fine, Dad," when he asked how she was doing. He had believed her, wanting to trust that his home was a safe and happy place for her. But now, standing just out of sight, he realized how wrong he had been. It wasn't just Rachel's harsh words that stung. It was the realization that Mia had been suffering in silence for who knows how long, and he hadn't seen it. He hadn't been there for her when she needed him most. His mind raced back to all the little moments, the times he'd come home late and found Mia already in bed, her chores done and her homework unfinished. The nights when she seemed too tired to speak, too worn down to laugh like she used to. Marcus had always thought of himself as a good father, someone who worked hard to provide for his family. But in that moment, he felt like a failure. He had been so focused on building a future for Mia that he had forgotten to pay attention to the present. And now, the consequences of that neglect were staring him in the face. When Rachel's voice had faded and she had moved into another room, Marcus had made his way to the kitchen, determined to talk to Mia. But now, standing in front of her, seeing the way she forced a smile and tried to act like everything was fine, he realized how deeply she had been hurt. And it wasn't just Rachel's fault. It was his fault, too. He hadn't been paying attention. "Mia," he said suddenly, his voice rougher than he intended. She looked up at him, startled. "Yes, Dad?" He struggled to find the right words, his throat tightening as the guilt washed over him. I've been meaning to ask you, is everything okay here? I mean, with Rachel? With everything?" Mia's eyes widened slightly, and for a brief moment, Marcus saw the truth flicker in her gaze, saw the fear, the sadness, and the exhaustion she'd been hiding for so long. But just as quickly as it had appeared, it was gone. Mia dropped her gaze and nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. Yeah, everything's fine. But Marcus knew better now. He couldn't ignore the signs anymore. He couldn't ignore what he had overheard. His heart ached as he realized that Mia was too afraid to tell him the truth. He had let her down, and now it was his responsibility to make things right. I know it's not, he said softly, reaching out to gently touch her shoulder. I know something's wrong, Mia, and I'm sorry. I'm sorry I didn't see it sooner. Mia's breath caught in her throat. She looked up at her father, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. For a moment, it felt like the walls she had built around herself were crumbling, piece by piece. She wanted to tell him everything, to let it all out, the hurt, the loneliness, the way Rachel had made her feel like she didn't belong. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, she simply nodded, and Marcus pulled her into a tight hug. I'm here now, he whispered, his voice breaking. I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere. For the first time in a long time, Mia felt a flicker of hope. The next morning, the house was cloaked in an uneasy silence. Mia woke early, as she always did, to start her daily chores, but there was a strange tension in the air that made her feel like something was about to break. She tiptoed down the stairs, moving carefully to avoid waking her stepsisters. The house felt heavy, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. As Mia entered the kitchen to begin breakfast, she found her father already sitting at the table, his face drawn and weary. His usual calm expression was replaced with something she couldn't quite read, an intensity that made her hesitate. He was nursing a cup of coffee, his hands wrapped tightly around the mug as if trying to anchor himself. Morning, Dad, she said softly, unsure if she should disturb whatever thoughts were weighing on him. He looked up at her, his eyes tired but filled with a warmth she hadn't seen in a long time. Mia, he said, his voice steady but low. Come sit with me for a minute. Her stomach tightened. She wasn't used to being invited to sit at the table before her chores were done, and certainly not for a conversation like this. She crossed the kitchen hesitantly and sat down across from him, folding her hands in her lap. Marcus took a deep breath before speaking, as though he were gathering his thoughts. I need to talk to you about something important. Mia's heart began to race. She wasn't sure where this conversation was going, but the serious tone in her father's voice told her it was something significant. She stayed silent, waiting for him to continue. I've been thinking a lot about what's been happening in this house, Marcus said, his eyes locking with hers. And I've realized that I haven't been paying enough attention to you, to how you've been treated. Mia looked down at her hands, her fingers twisting nervously in her lap. She wanted to tell him everything, but there was still a part of her that was afraid of what might happen if she spoke the full truth, and afraid of what Rachel would do if she found out. But Marcus wasn't finished. He leaned forward slightly, his voice softening. Mia, I know things haven't been easy for you. I know Rachel has been harsh, and I want you to know that it's not your fault. None of this is your fault. Tears sprang to Mia's eyes before she could stop them. She blinked rapidly, trying to hold them back, but it was too late. The floodgates had opened, and the pain she had been bottling up for so long began to spill over. I'm sorry, Dad, she whispered, her voice trembling. I didn't want to cause any trouble. I didn't want to make things worse for you. Marcus shook his head, his expression filled with sorrow. You have nothing to apologize for, Mia. You're a child. You deserve to be treated with kindness and love, not like some burden. Mia's chest tightened as she fought to keep her emotions under control, but the truth was finally bubbling to the surface. I just want you to be happy. I didn't want you to think I was being ungrateful. Marcus reached across the table and took her hands in his, squeezing them gently. Mia, you are my daughter. My happiness isn't more important than your well-being. I should have seen what was happening. I should have been there for you. For the first time in what felt like forever, Mia felt a sense of relief. Her father believed her. He saw her. She wasn't invisible anymore. But there was still a lingering fear. What would happen now? What would Rachel do when she found out that her facade had crumbled? Marcus seemed to read her thoughts. I'm going to talk to Rachel today, he said firmly. Things are going to change, Mia, I promise you that. The dread that had been building in Mia's chest tightened. What if? What if she gets mad? What if things get worse? Marcus's jaw clenched, and for a moment Mia saw a flicker of anger in his eyes. Not at her, but at the situation. Rachel's behavior is not acceptable, and I won't tolerate it anymore. I'll make sure she understands that. The strength in her father's voice gave Mia a small sense of comfort, but she was still scared. She had never seen anyone stand up to Rachel before, and she wasn't sure what would happen when her father did. But for the first time, she wasn't facing it alone. Her father was on her side now. Later that morning, while Mia was upstairs in her room, she heard her father call Rachel into the living room. The sound of their voices, though muffled, drifted up through the floorboards, and Mia found herself sitting on the edge of her bed, listening to the conversation with her heart pounding in her chest. "I want to talk to you about Mia," Marcus said, his tone calm but firm. There was a long pause, and then Rachel's voice responded, her words clipped and defensive. "What about her?" "I know how you've been treating her," Marcus said, his voice gaining an edge of steel. "I know about the chores, the way you speak to her, and the way you've made her feel like she doesn't belong here. It stops today." Mia held her breath, her hands gripping the blanket tightly. She could hear the rising tension in Rachel's voice as she tried to defend herself. "I don't know what you're talking about, Marcus. I've been doing my best to discipline her. She's been acting out, and I thought you'd appreciate some structure." "That's not structure, Rachel," Marcus shot back, his voice hardening. "That's cruelty. You've made her feel like an outsider in her own home. She's a child. She's not a servant." Rachel's voice rose, sharp and accusatory. "You don't understand. You're not here all the time. You don't see how she acts. She needs to be taught how to behave properly." Mia could hear the frustration in her father's voice as he replied, "She's not the problem, Rachel. The problem is your attitude, your prejudice. I heard what you said yesterday about how she's not like us. I won't have that in my house. I won't have you treating her like she's less than just because she's different." There was a stunned silence, and Mia felt her heart racing. Rachel was always so composed, always in control of the situation, but now for the first time it sounded like she was caught off guard. "You're being ridiculous," Rachel finally spat, her voice cold and angry. "You're letting her manipulate you. She's just playing the victim." "No, Rachel," Marcus said, his voice steady. "She's not the one manipulating anyone. You are. And it ends now. I don't care what it takes, but things are going to change. Either you start treating Mia with the respect and kindness she deserves, or this family isn't going to work." Mia couldn't hear Rachel's response after that. The voices faded as they moved further into the house, and she sat there on her bed, her mind reeling. Her father had stood up for her. He had defended her, called out Rachel's behavior, and for the first time, Mia felt a flicker of hope that things might actually change. Later that day, Marcus came to her room. His expression was calm, but there was a sadness in his eyes. He sat down beside her, and without saying a word, he pulled her into a hug. "It's going to be okay, Mia," he whispered. "I'm going to make sure of it." Mia nodded, tears filling her eyes as she clung to her father. She didn't know what the future held, but in that moment, she felt safe. She felt seen. And for the first time in a long time, she believed that things might finally get better. In the days following the confrontation between Marcus and Rachel, the house felt like it had been turned upside down. Rachel's usual commanding presence seemed to falter, and though she didn't openly argue with Marcus, the tension was palpable. The once controlled and orderly household was now filled with an uneasy quiet, as if the walls themselves were waiting for the storm to pass. Mia, for the first time, in what felt like forever, was no longer subjected to the endless cycle of chores. Her father had made it clear that she would no longer bear the weight of running the household, while Rachel's daughters remained free of responsibility. Yet, despite the lightened burden, Mia couldn't shake the feeling of uncertainty. She had always lived with the understanding that things could change at any moment, and now, even with her father's protection, she was still bracing herself for the other shoe to drop. Rachel's coldness, however, had only deepened. She barely spoke to Mia, her interactions reduced to cold stares and clipped words. Marcus had taken over most of the household duties, stepping in wherever Mia used to be responsible. all while trying to keep the peace between them. But Rachel's anger was like a storm gathering on the horizon, growing darker and more dangerous with each passing day. Mia could see it in the way she moved through the house, her lips pressed into a thin line, her eyes full of contempt that she no longer bothered to hide. Then, one evening, everything came to a head. Rachel had been pacing the living room, her movements sharp and agitated. Marcus had been away at work, and Mia was sitting at the kitchen table, trying to finish her homework, when Rachel suddenly stopped in front of her. The tension in the air crackled like electricity, and Mia felt her heart race as Rachel's gaze bore down on her. "You think this is over, don't you?" Rachel's voice was cold, laced with bitterness. "You think your father coming to your rescue has changed anything?" Mia froze, her hands gripping the edge of her notebook. She didn't know how to respond. Rachel had been largely ignoring her since the confrontation, but the resentment had clearly been simmering under the surface, and now it was ready to erupt. "You're still the same little girl," Rachel continued, her words sharp and cutting. "You don't belong here. You never did. Your father can't fix that." Mia felt the sting of Rachel's words like a slap. She wanted to stand up for herself, to say something in her defense, but the fear of making things worse kept her silent. Rachel had a way of making Mia feel small, like she wasn't worth fighting for, and even now, with her father on her side, Mia wasn't sure how to break free from the weight of that fear. Rachel leaned in closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. "You've ruined everything." Just then, the front door opened, and Marcus stepped inside. His eyes immediately went to Mia and Rachel, and he seemed to sense the tension in the room. His face hardened as he closed the door behind him and walked toward them. "What's going on here?" Marcus's voice was calm, but there was a warning edge to it. Rachel straightened up, her icy demeanor returning as she turned to face him. "I was just having a conversation with your daughter," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. Marcus's eyes narrowed. He looked from Rachel to Mia, who was still sitting frozen at the table, her heart pounding in her chest. "Rachel," Marcus said, his voice firm, "we've talked about this. Mia is not to be treated this way." Rachel's lips thinned. "You think you can fix everything by swooping in like some hero, but you're not seeing the full picture, Marcus. She's been playing you." "Enough." Marcus's voice was calm, but the force behind it silenced the room. He stepped closer to Mia, placing a hand on her shoulder. "Mia hasn't done anything wrong. The only problem here is how you've been treating her." For a long moment, the room was filled with silence. Rachel stood there, her face tight with anger, but Marcus's resolve didn't waver. Mia could feel the tension coiling tighter, and she braced herself for whatever would come next. But Rachel didn't yell or lash out. Instead, she turned on her heel and walked upstairs, her footsteps heavy on the wooden floor. The slam of her bedroom door echoed through the house, leaving a weighty silence in its wake. Marcus sighed, rubbing a hand across his face. He looked down at Mia, his expression softening. "Are you okay?" Mia nodded, but her throat felt tight. She didn't want to admit how scared she had been, how Rachel's words had cut her so deeply. But Marcus seemed to understand. He pulled a chair next to her and sat down. "You don't have to be afraid anymore," he said quietly. "I'm here, and I'm not going to let her treat you that way ever again." Mia felt the tightness in her chest loosen just a little. She wanted to believe him, wanted to trust that things would really change. But after so many years of feeling small and unwanted, it was hard to let go of the fear that Rachel's cruelty had planted in her heart. In the days that followed, Rachel's presence in the house became more and more distant. She spent most of her time in her room or out with friends, barely acknowledging Marcus or Mia. The distance only grew wider between her and Marcus, as he made it clear that things had to change. Marcus had hoped that Rachel would try to repair the damage she had caused, but it became clear that her heart was set on blame, not resolution. Then, one evening, Rachel packed her bags and left. There was no dramatic goodbye, no final confrontation. She simply told Marcus she needed time to think, and that it was best if she stayed with her sister for a while. Marcus didn't argue. He had seen the cracks forming in their relationship for some time now, and as much as he wanted to keep the family together for Mia's sake, he knew that sometimes the only way to heal was to let go. With Rachel gone, the house felt lighter, but there was still a sense of loss that lingered in the air. Mia wasn't sure how to feel about it all. Part of her was relieved, but another part of her, one that she didn't fully understand, felt conflicted. She had never wanted to tear her family apart. She had only wanted to be treated with kindness. Marcus, too, seemed to be processing the aftermath of Rachel's departure. He spent more time at home now, making sure Mia knew how much he cared for her. He encouraged her to invite friends over, to play outside, to focus on school again. Slowly, Mia began to open up, her bright spirit returning in small, cautious steps. One day, while they were sitting together on the back porch, Mia spoke up, her voice quiet but steady. "Do you think she'll ever come back?" Marcus looked out at the trees swaying in the wind, his expression thoughtful. "I don't know, Mia, but if she does, things will have to be different. We won't go back to the way things were." Mia nodded, understanding more than she wanted to. She didn't miss the way Rachel made her feel, but there was still a part of her that wondered what it might have been like if things had been different, if Rachel had chosen love over bitterness, if she had been willing to embrace Mia as part of her family. But Mia also knew that not everyone would choose love. Not everyone would see the value in people who were different from them. And that was something she had to learn to accept. As the weeks turned into months, Mia's world began to shift. Without Rachel's constant shadow hanging over her, she started to feel like herself again. She excelled at school, her grades improving now that she wasn't burdened with exhaustion. She reconnected with friends, building new relationships that filled her with joy. And, most importantly, her bond with her father grew stronger. Marcus, too, was healing. He was learning how to be more present, how to listen to Mia in a way that he hadn't before. The guilt he carried for not seeing the signs earlier was still there, but it didn't define him anymore. He had learned that it wasn't too late to make things right, and that love, true, unconditional love, could mend the deepest wounds. One afternoon, as they sat together in the backyard, Marcus turned to Mia with a smile. "You know, your mom would be proud of you. She always said you had the strongest heart of anyone she knew." Mia smiled softly, her heart swelling with warmth. She hadn't heard her father talk about her mother in a long time, but hearing those words filled her with a sense of peace. "I think she'd be proud of you too, Dad," Mia said, leaning into his side. And in that moment, as they sat together in the fading light of the afternoon, Mia knew that they were going to be okay. The pain of the past would always be a part of their story, but it wouldn't define them. They had each other, and that was enough. Together, they would keep moving forward, their hearts healing with each passing day. Thanks for joining us. If you enjoyed this story, don't miss the next one. Click on the video now to watch. We appreciate your support and we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments.